In this last section of 11.5, we kind of want to recap all the sections that we've learned so far in Chapter 11 and realize which section applies to what. Because, of course, when you get the final exam or a project or a paper and pencil project or papers, you won't be told all the time which type of test you're doing or which type of confidence interval you're making. All right, so section 11.2, if you remember back that far, was the section where we were interested in the mean difference for dependent samples, right? So when the data was in, or data sets were dependent. Let me put that down. Dependent means, right? So if it's dependent means, that was section 11.2. The test statistic for that was the X bar for D, right? Which was the sample difference. Remember, this is the section where you find the differences first, and then you find the mean for those differences. Okay, so let's find the test statistic, which when we look at the inferential statistics sheet right here, the test statistic is always your step 3 value right there. So there's the test statistic. It's D bar over SD over the square root of N. And while I'm on the subject, when we look at the calculator at the top tells us that we want to use a t-test. And that'll give us our test statistic value as well as our p-value if we're doing the p-value method. Okay, so the test statistic is step 3, and the calculator is the t-test. So we'll do that. And don't forget that the test statistic can come from step 3, is from step 3, but it can come from the calculator output. And then the t-test, that same calculator output, will give you your p-value. The distribution you're using here is obviously t, that's why it's t0. And since it's the t distribution, that means that your critical values are plus or minus t alpha over 2 for a two-tailed test, then negative t alpha and positive t alpha for a left-tailed and right-tailed test, respectively. And then you'd find those values with either inverse t on the calculator, which is above your variables button, right there in the distribution menu, it's number 4. Inverse t, or you could use the t-table for some of the values. Not all the values are in the t-table, but some of them are in here. Okay. Now 11.2 is really a lot like a chapter 10 problem. It's very, very similar. 11.3 and 11.1 though are different, quite different. So let's look at them. So 11.3 was the next one we did. We went out of order. So 11.3 was also for means, but it was for independent means, right? So when we're talking about independent means, that's 11.3. All right, and that meant that the difference was x bar 1 minus x bar 2, right? So you actually find the differences in those two values. Unlike in 11.2, in 11.2 you go find a big row of differences and then just find the mean of those differences. In 11.3 you actually find the mean for each separate group. And the test statistic comes from step 3. So let me go to that. And you can see it right here. But then we just say just use the calculator because it's too much of a pain to find. So we just use the calculator. So let me scroll that down. There we go. Now that does not use the t-test. It uses a different one called the Two-Samp T-Test, right? So we are going to use the Two-Samp T-Test, but again, still using the t distribution. So it still has the same critical values of negative t alpha over 2 and negative t alpha, positive t alpha, or plus or minus t alpha over 2. Again, that's a two-tailed, a left-tailed, and a right-tailed. There, and I'll add that into those just to make it really clear. So it's two-tailed and actually a confidence interval as well, because confidence intervals use the same thing as the two-tailed test. So it's two-tailed and CI. Here, let me fix that. Two-tailed slash CI, and then left-tailed and right-tailed. So here, there we go. And left-tailed and right-tailed. Okay. All right, and then the other one works the same way. So the left-tailed and the right-tailed are the last two, and the confidence interval and CI ones are that middle set. There, that looks a little bit better. Okay, so then again, you find those with the inverse t. And remember, we kind of lie a little bit here. Degrees of freedom, for our purposes, because we're just doing a very simple test, we're going to take the smaller of the two degrees of freedom. Remember that there's actually a very, very complicated formula for that, degrees of freedom, that we're not covering in our course. So we're just going to use the smaller one. That's the more generous way to do it. All right, then we went to 11.1. So these were both for means, for averages. So we had dependent means, and then we had independent means. Dependent ones were the ones where it was matched pairs, where it's talking about the average for groups that are matched up together, like pre-test, post-test, husbands and wives, that kind of thing. Independent are two groups that have nothing to do with each other, men and women, boys and girls, stuff like that. And then 11.1 is also two groups that have nothing to do with each other, but it's for proportions. So it's P1 minus P2, and that means that it's independent proportions. So I'm just going to put independent proportions. And that means that P1 hat minus P2 hat is actually our statistic that we're going to use. And then the test statistic is very, very complicated, but we're just going to use the calculator to do it. We're not going to do it by hand because it's such a pain. It involves another formula, if you recall, to find p hat. P hat has its own formula, and then you plug that in to find all of this, and it's just a giant mess. So we're just going to use the calculator and make the calculator or computer output give it to us. And now what calculator computer output would that be? Well, let's go find that test. So the 11.1 test, the two proportions for independent samples, is the 2-prop z test. So we're going to make that a 2-prop z test. Right there. And there we have it, 2-prop z test. And that is, of course, using the z distribution. So that's our distribution. And then the confidence intervals / two-tailed test would be z alpha over 2 plus or minus. And then negative z alpha for a left-tailed test and positive z alpha for a right-tailed test. I'm actually going to make that same judgment here that I did on the other part there. So two-tailed, left-tailed, right-tailed. So the left-tailed is the middle one, the right-tailed is the far right one, and so on. And we use either inverse norm with that left area or the bottom row of the t-table. The bottom row of the t-table is our z values, but it's only a few of them. So there's only like 12 of them here. So if it's anything other than these 12, you have to use the calculator, which will be inverse norm. And inverse norm is above your distribution menu. Right there, number 3. All right, also don't forget where to get the tests from, just real quick. T-test, which is from 11.2, is number 2. Two-Samp T-test, that's 11.3, that's number 4. And then the 2-prop Z-test is number 6. And for number 4 and number 2, you always have the option of data or stats. Stats would mean they give you a giant paragraph of information, and you had to decide it was independent means and fill out all the info. Data is if they give you 2 separate data sets, one for each group, and then you can work from there. Also, real quickly while I look at it, I noticed that the bottom, those hypotheses, you have to be very, very careful in Chapter 11 because words like less than do not always mean left-tailed test. It all depends on which group is group 1 and which group is group 2. So be very, very careful. In general, if you end up with a p-value that's very large, like say your p-value is 0.92 or something like that, that's usually a red flag that you picked the wrong direction for your test. Just a little side note for you. All right, we're all done with Chapter 11. I'll see you back here for more tutorials for later chapters.